Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. We continue to speak about React hooks and React context. In the last lesson, we spoke about some JSX and useState hook. Today, we will speak about context and UUID. Let's begin. The first thing that we will talk about, what is context? Before context, we were passing the data from parent to child via props, and as you can see the image at left, we are passing props to each level. For example, if you want to pass some properties to play button from root app, first we have to pass from root app to the body, and then from the body we have to pass these properties to the play button. As you can understand that, especially if you want to pass some props through many levels, this is not the effective way. But what about context? As you can see in this image, with context, this data is available to every component without passing prop to each level. Context provides use to pass data through the component tree without having to pass props down manually at every level. Let's go back our application and create our first context. In our application, we are sharing the data in the employee list file. Now we will create a new context file. And in the src folder, I will create a new folder. Name is context. Inside the context file, we will create our first context file and will be employee context.js. First, we create context with create context function and name it as a employee context. It will be like const employee context, and this employee context will be created by create context function. Create context. This context object has two properties, and they are provider and consumer. This provider and consumer are matched with each other. They know how to communicate with them. Provider sending data and consumer receiving this data. They don't have any relation with other context. We will create the provider object inside the provider function. Let's write the provider function, and it will be like const employee context provider, and it will be a function. As a parameter, it will take props, and let's write in an arrow function. This provider function will return the provider. Return provider. What was the provider? The properties of this context, and it will be a component employee context dot provider. And here it will send the data to its child. So we will write here props dot children. So what is the data in our case? In our case, the data is our employee list. So we will go to employee list.js, and we are taking this list with Ctrl X. We are cutting it, and we are pasting inside of our provider function, and save the file. And I am saving the employee list.file. So we don't need to import useState hook inside of employee list.js. I erase it, and let's come back to our context. Now inside of our employee context, we have to import useState and create context files. Let's import them. Import create context and useState from React library. And also we have to export default this context provider function. Export default employee context provider. We will also export this employee context, but it is not a default, just we will export like that, export and save the file. And how can we send this information? We will send this information as a value of this provider. So we will write that value is equal employees. This provider will send this value to its children. Where do you want to send this information? To the employee list file. And where is our employee list file? Inside of this app.js. So we has to cover this employee list with our employee context provider. So I will come to app.js, and I will import employee context provider from context, and inside of employee context we are importing it. Be careful we don't use a parent curly braces because we are exporting this file as a default. And now we have to cover our employee list with this provider. Employee list context provider, open and close employee context provider, and cover employee list. Save the file again. Okay, so far so good. Now we are sending the data from context provider to employee list. Now what we have to do, we have to consume this data in employee list.js. In employee list.js, what we have to do, we have to first import useContext, second import employee context, which we will use. So let's come here and in the beginning import use context hook from React, and then later we have to import our context, import employee context from context file and from employee context. But we have to cover this with curly braces because in employee context we are exporting this employee context, but it is not a default, so we have to cover this employee context with curly braces. And now we will invoke useContext hook with employee context and assign it to employees because from the context we are sending these employees. What we will do, const, we will use distracting method again, employees is equal to use context, and this use context will be take a parameter, the context that we want to use. Save the file, and everything is working now. And as you can see here, we are receiving a warning message because let's go to context. Here we are setting set employees function, but for now we don't do any changes, so for now we don't need this function. We can erase it. Later we will add this one. Save the file, and everything is working. And let's go our application, refresh, everything is working. Let's look to components. In the components, when you come to context provider, look, we are sending the context provider employees information as a value to the children. In our case, the children is employee list. When you go to the employee list, you can see that our employees information now inside of a context. I know and I understand that it's overwhelmed a lot. So let's repeat what we have done so far. Let's go back to our application. First we create our employee context. And then this employee context has two properties. One of them is provider, the other one is consumer. But be careful. Here we are sending this provider information with provider function. This is the provider function and this is the provider part of our context. And we are providing this data with provider. To receive this data, what we have to third, we are covering in app.js, we are covering employee list with our provider function, and then to receive this information in the employee list.js, employee list.js is a children in our case. We are creating the useContext hook and we are taking these hooks for using it. Here we are distracting the employees information which we will use here, and as you can see everything is working as we expected. Important topic about useContext hook, it will always re-render when the context is changed. For example, let's go there and inside of the employee context, let's say we say Thomas Hardy 10, save the file, and as you can see our Thomas Hardy name is changed. When you change the context, useContext hook will re-render. Now let's talk about UUID package. UUID package is an ID generator in RFC format. In our application, as you can see, we are using this static data. Later we will receive this name, email and other information from the user. But for ID, we will use this UUID generator. And let's look the instruction how we can use it. First, we have to install with npm install UUID. Let's copy this command, come back our application. With Ctrl C, you can stop the server. Yes, and enter. Later, npm install UUID. The install is finished, and let's start again our server with npm start. Let's go back to documentation. We will use this ES6 model syntax and we will import like that. Let's copy this one with Ctrl C. We will use it here. Let's paste this to the employee context.js. For using, we have to invoke this function, copy this UUID v4 function with Ctrl C and Ctrl V, Ctrl V, Ctrl V 5 times, Ctrl V, save the file, and let's go back to our application again, manage employees here, inspect, and from the component, let's go to components, and here the components, when you open the props, here you can see that now we have new generated IDs. This is the end of our lesson. In the next lesson, we will continue to speak React hooks and React context.